investing. Inactivity strikes us as intelligent behavior. Neither we nor most business managers would dream of feverishly trading highly profitable subsidiaries because a small move in the Federal Reserve's discount rate was predicted or because some Wall Street pundit had reversed his views on the market. Why, then, should we behave differently with our minority positions in wonderful businesses? The art of investing in public companies successfully is little different from the art of successfully acquiring subsidiaries. In each case, you simply want to acquire, at a sensible price, a business with excellent economics and able, honest management. Thereafter, you need only monitor whether these qualities are being preserved. When carried out capably, an investment strategy of that type will often result in its practitioner owning a few securities that will come to represent a very large portion of his portfolio. This investor would get a similar result if he followed a policy of purchasing an interest in, say, 20% of the future earnings of a number of outstanding college basketball stars. A handful of these would go on to achieve NBA stardom, and the investor's take from them would soon dominate his royalty stream. To suggest that this investor should sell off portions of his most successful investments simply because they have come to dominate his portfolio is akin to suggesting that the Bulls trade Michael Jordan because he has become so important to the team. In studying the investments we have made in both subsidiary companies and common stocks, you will see that we favor businesses and industries unlikely to experience major change. The reason for that is simple. Making either type of purchase, we are searching for operations that we believe are virtually certain to possess enormous competitive strength 10 or 20 years from now. A fast-changing industry environment may offer the chance for huge wins, but it precludes the certainty we seek. I should emphasize that, as citizens, Charlie and I welcome change. Fresh ideas, new products, innovative processes, and the like cause our country's standard of living to rise, and that's clearly good. As investors, however, our reaction to a fermenting industry is much like our attitude towards space exploration. We applaud the endeavor but prefer to skip the ride. Obviously, all businesses change to some extent. Today, See's Candies is different in many ways from what it was in 1972 when we bought it. It offers a different assortment of candy, employs different machinery, and sells through different distribution channels. But the reasons why people today buy boxed chocolates and why they buy from us rather than from someone else are virtually unchanged from what they were in the 1920s when the See family was building the business. Moreover, these motivations are not likely to change over the next 20 years or even 50. We look for similar predictability in marketable securities. Take Coca-Cola. The zeal and imagination with which Coke products are sold burgeoned under Roberto Goizueta, who did an absolutely incredible job in creating value for his shareholders. Aided by Don Kioff and Doug Ivester, Roberto rethought and improved every aspect of the company. But the fundamentals of the business, the qualities that underlie Coke's competitive dominance and stunning economics, have remained constant through the years. I was recently studying the 1896 report of Coke, and you think that you are behind in your reading. At that time, Coke, though it was already the leading soft drink, had been around for only a decade. But its blueprint for the next 100 years was already drawn. Reporting sales of $148,000 that year, Asa Candler, the company's president, said, "We have not lagged in our efforts to go into all the world teaching that Coca-Cola is the article par excellence for the health and good feeling of all people. Though health may have been a reach, I love the fact that Coke still relies on Candler's basic theme today, a century later." Candler went on to say, just as Roberto could now, "No article of like character has ever so firmly entrenched itself in public favor." Sales of syrup that year, incidentally, were 116,492 gallons versus about 3.2 billion in 1996. I can't resist one more Candler quote. Beginning this year, about March 1st, we employed 10 traveling salesmen by means of which, with systematic correspondence from the office, we covered almost the territory of the Union. That's my kind of sales force. Companies such as Coca-Cola might well be labeled the inevitables. Forecasters may differ a bit in their predictions of exactly how much soft drink or shaving equipment business these companies will be doing in 10 or 20 years. Nor is our talk of inevitability meant to play down the vital work that these companies must continue to carry out in such areas as manufacturing, distribution, packaging, and product innovation. In the end, however, no sensible observer, not even these companies' most vigorous competitors, assuming they are assessing the matter honestly, questions that Coke will dominate worldwide for an investment lifetime. Indeed, dominance will probably strengthen. Obviously, many companies in high-tech businesses or embryonic industries will grow much faster in percentage terms than will the inevitables. But I would rather be certain of a good result than hopeful of a great one. Of course, Charlie and I can identify with only a few inevitables, even after a lifetime of looking for them. Leadership alone provides no certainties. Witness the shocks some years back as General Motors, IBM, and Sears, all of which had enjoyed long periods of seeming invincibility. Though some industries or lines of business exhibit characteristics that endow leaders with virtually insurmountable advantages, and that tend to establish survival of the fattest as almost a natural law, most do not. Thus, for every inevitable, there are dozens of imposters, companies now riding high but vulnerable to competitive attacks. Considering what it takes to be an inevitable, Charlie and I recognize that we will never be able to come up with a nifty 50 or even a twinkling 20. To the inevitables in our portfolio, therefore, we add a few highly probables. You can, of course, pay too much for even the best of businesses. The overpayment risk surfaces periodically and, in my opinion, may now be quite high for the purchasers of virtually all stocks, the inevitables included. Investors making purchases in an overheated market need to recognize that it may often take an extended period for the value of even an outstanding company to catch up with the price they paid. A far more serious problem occurs when the management of a great company gets sidetracked and neglects its wonderful base business while purchasing other businesses that are so-so or worse. When that happens, the suffering of investors is often prolonged. Unfortunately, that is precisely what transpired years ago at Coke. Would you believe that a few decades back they were growing shrimp at Coke? Loss of focus is what most worries Charlie and me when we contemplate investing in businesses that in general look outstanding. All too often, we've seen values stagnate in the presence of hubris or of boredom that cause the attention of managers to wander. That's not going to happen again at Coke, however, not given current and prospective managements. Let me add a few thoughts about your own investments. Most investors, both institutional and individual, will find that the best way to own common stocks is through an index fund that charges minimal fees. Those following this path are sure to beat the net results after fees and expenses delivered by the great majority of investment professionals. Should you choose, however, to construct your own portfolio, there are a few thoughts worth remembering. Intelligent investing is not complex, though that is far from saying that it is easy. What an investor needs is the ability to correctly evaluate selected businesses. Note that the word selected. You don't have to be an expert on every company or even many. You only have to be able to evaluate companies within your circle of competence. The size of that circle is not very important. Knowing its boundaries, however, is vital. To invest successfully, you need not understand beta, efficient markets, modern portfolio theory, option pricing, or emerging markets. You may, in fact, be better off knowing nothing of these. That, of course, is not the prevailing view at most business schools, whose finance curriculum tends to be dominated by such subjects. In our view, though, investment students need only two well-taught courses, how to value a business and how to think about market prices. Your goal as an investor should be simply to purchase, at a rational price, a part interest in an easily understandable business whose earnings are virtually certain to be materially higher 5, 10, and 20 years from now. Over time, you will find only a few companies that meet these standards, so when you see one that qualifies, you should buy a meaningful amount of stock. You must also resist the temptation to stray from your guidelines. If you aren't willing to own a stock for 10 years, don't even think about owning it for 10 minutes. Put together a portfolio of companies whose aggregate earnings march upward over the years, and so also will the portfolio's market value. Though it's seldom recognized, this is the exact approach that has produced gains for Berkshire shareholders. Our look-through earnings have grown at a good clip over the years, and our stock price has risen correspondingly. Had those gains in earnings not materialized, there would have been little increase in Berkshire's value. Several of the companies in which we have large investments had disappointing business results last year. Nevertheless, we believe these companies have important competitive advantages that will endure over time. This attribute, which makes for good long-term investment results, is one Charlie and I occasionally believe we can identify. More often, however, we can't, not at least with a high degree of conviction. This explains, by the way, why we don't own stocks of tech companies, even though we share the general view that our society will be transformed by their products and services. Our problem, which we can't solve by studying up, is that we have no insights into which participants in the tech field possess a truly durable competitive advantage. Our lack of tech insights, we should add, does not distress us. After all, there are a great many business areas in which Charlie and I have no special capital allocation expertise. For instance, we bring nothing to the table when it comes to evaluating patents, manufacturing processes, or geological prospects. So we simply don't get into judgments in those fields. If we have a strength, it is in recognizing when we are operating well within our circle of competence and when we are approaching the perimeter. Predicting the long-term economics of companies that operate in fast-changing industries is simply far beyond our perimeter. If others claim predictive skill in those industries and seem to have their claims validated by the behavior of the stock market, we neither envy nor emulate them. Instead, we just stick with what we understand. If we stray, we will have done so inadvertently, not because we got restless and substituted hope for rationality. Fortunately, it's almost certain there will be opportunities from time to time for Berkshire to do well within the circle we've staked out. Right now, the prices of the fine businesses we already own are just not that attractive. In other words, we feel much better about the businesses than their stocks. That's why we haven't added to our present holdings. Nevertheless, we haven't yet scaled back our portfolio in a major way. If the choice is between a questionable business at a comfortable price or a comfortable business at a questionable price, we much prefer the latter. What really gets our attention, however, is a comfortable business at a comfortable price. Our reservations about the prices of securities we own apply also to the general level of equity prices. We have never attempted to forecast what the stock market is going to do in the next month or the next year, and we are not trying to do that now. But as of late 1999, equity investors currently seem wildly optimistic in their expectations about future returns. We see the growth in corporate profits as being largely tied to the business done in the country GDP, and we see GDP growing at a real rate of about 3%. In addition, we have hypothesized 2% inflation. Charlie and I have no particular conviction about the accuracy of 2%. However, it's the market's view. Treasury inflation-protected securities, TIPS, yield about 2 percentage points less than the standard Treasury bond. And if you believe that inflation rates are going to be higher than that, you can profit by simply buying TIPS and shorting governments. If profits do indeed grow along with GDP at about a 5% rate, the valuation placed on American business is unlikely to climb by much more than that. Add in something for dividends, and you emerge with returns from equities that are dramatically less than most investors have either experienced in the past or expect in the future. If investor expectations become more realistic, and they almost certainly will, the market adjustment is apt to be severe, particularly in sectors in which speculation has been concentrated. Berkshire will someday have opportunities to deploy major amounts of cash in equity markets. We are confident of that. But as the song goes, who knows where or when? Meanwhile, if anyone starts explaining to you what is going on in the truly manic portions of this enchanted market, you might remember still another line of song, "Fools give you reasons, wise men never try." At times when prices are high for both businesses and stocks, we try to exert a Ted Williams kind of discipline. In his book, The Science of Hitting, Ted explains that he carved the strike zone into 77 cells, each the size of a baseball. Swinging only at balls in his best cell, he knew, would allow him to bat .400. Reaching for balls in his worst spot, the low outside corner of the strike zone, would reduce him to .230. In other words, waiting for the fat pitch would mean a trip to the Hall of Fame. Swinging indiscriminately would mean a ticket to the minors. If they are in the strike zone at all, the business pitches we now see are just catching the lower outside corner. If we swing, we will be locked into low returns. But if we let all of today's balls go by, there can be no assurance that the next ones we see will be more to our liking. Perhaps the attractive prices of the past were aberrations, not the full prices of today. Unlike Ted, we can't be called out if we resist 3 pitches that are barely in the strike zone, Nevertheless, just standing there day after day with my bat on my shoulder is not my idea of fun. Cigar butts and the institutional imperative. To quote Robert Benchley, having a dog teaches a boy fidelity, perseverance, and to turn around 3 times before lying down. Such are the shortcomings of experience. Nevertheless, it's a good idea to review past mistakes before committing new ones. So let's take a quick look at the last 25 years. My first mistake, of course, was in buying control of Berkshire. Though I knew its business, textile manufacturing, to be unpromising, I was enticed to buy because the price looked cheap. Stock purchases of that kind had proved reasonably rewarding in my early years, though by the time Berkshire came along in 1965, I was becoming aware that the strategy was not ideal. If you buy a stock at a sufficiently low price, there will usually be some hiccup in the fortunes of the business that gives you a chance to unload at a decent profit, even though the long-term performance of the business may be terrible. I call this the cigar butt approach to investing. A cigar butt found on the street that has only one puff left in it may not offer much of a smoke, but the bargain purchase will make that puff all profit. Unless you are a liquidator, that kind of approach to buying business is foolish. First, the original bargain price probably will not turn out to be such a steal after all. In a difficult business, no sooner is one problem solved than another surfaces, never is there just one cockroach in the kitchen. Second, any initial advantage you secure will be quickly eroded by the low return that the business earns. For example, if you buy a business for $8 million that can be sold or liquidated for $10 million and promptly take either course, you can realize a high return. But the investment will disappoint if the business is sold for $10 million in 10 years and in the interim has annually earned and distributed only a few % on cost. Time is the friend of the wonderful business, the enemy of the mediocre. You might think this principle is obvious, but I had to learn it the hard way. In fact, I had to learn it several times over. Shortly after purchasing Berkshire, I acquired a Baltimore department store, Hochschild Kohn, buying through a company called Diversified Retailing that later merged with Berkshire. I bought at a substantial discount from book value, the people were first class, and the deal included some extras, unrecorded real estate values, and a significant LIFO inventory cushion. How could I miss? So, 3 years later, I was lucky to sell the business for about what I had paid. That leads right into a related lesson. Good jockeys will do well on good horses, but not on broken-down nags. Both Berkshire's textile businesses and Hochschild Kohn had able and honest people running them. The same managers employed in the business with good economic characteristics would have achieved fine records, but they were never going to make any progress while running in quicksand. I've said many times that when a management with a reputation for brilliance tackles a business with a reputation for bad economics, it is the reputation of the business that remains intact. I just wish I hadn't been so energetic in creating examples. My behavior was matched that admitted by Mae West. I was Snow White, but I drifted. A further related lesson, easy does it. After 25 years of buying and supervising a great variety of businesses, Charlie and I have not learned how to solve difficult business problems. What we have learned is to avoid them. To the extent we have been successful, it is because we concentrated on identifying 1-foot hurdles that we could step over rather than because we acquired any ability to clear 7-footers. The finding may seem unfair, but in both business and investments it is usually far more profitable to simply stick with the easy and obvious than it is to resolve the difficult. On occasion, tough problems must be tackled. In other instances, a great investment opportunity occurs when a marvelous business encounters a one-time huge but solvable problem, as was the case many years back at both American Express and Geico. Overall, however, we've done better by avoiding dragons than by slaying them. My most surprising discovery, the overwhelming importance in business of an unseen force that we might call the institutional imperative. In business school, I was given no hint of the imperative's existence, and I did not intuitively understand it when I entered the business world. I thought then that decent, intelligent, and experienced managers would automatically make rational business decisions, but I learned over time that isn't so. Instead, rationality frequently wilts when the institutional imperative comes into play. For example, 1. As if governed by Newton's first law of motion, an institution will resist any change in its current direction. 2. Just as work expands to fill available time, corporate projects or acquisitions will materialize to soak up available funds. 3. Any business craving of the leader, however foolish, will be quickly supported by detailed rate of return and strategic studies prepared by his troops. And 4. The behavior of peer companies, whether they are expanding, acquiring, setting executive compensation, or whatever, will be mindlessly imitated. Institutional dynamics, not banality or stupidity, set businesses on these courses, which are too often misguided. After making some expensive mistakes because I ignored the power of the imperative, I have tried to organize and manage Berkshire in ways that minimize its influence. Furthermore, Charlie and I have attempted to concentrate our investments in companies that appear alert to the problem. After some other mistakes, I learned to go into business only with people whom I like, trust, and admire. As I noted before, this policy of itself will not ensure success. A second-class textile or department store company won't prosper simply because its managers are people that you would be pleased to see your children marry. However, an owner or investor can accomplish wonders if he manages to associate himself with such people and businesses that possess decent economic characteristics. Conversely, we do not wish to join with managers who lack admirable qualities, no matter how attractive the prospects of their business. We've never succeeded in making a good deal with a bad person. Some of my worst mistakes were not publicly visible. These were stock and business purchases whose virtues I understood and yet didn't make. It's no sin to miss a great opportunity outside one's area of competence. But I have passed on a couple of really big purchases that were served up to me on a platter and that I was fully capable of understanding. For Berkshire shareholders, myself included, the cost of this thumb-sucking has been huge. Our consistently conservative financial policies may appear to have been a mistake, but in my view were not. In retrospect, it is clear that significantly higher, though still conventional, leverage ratios at Berkshire would have produced considerably better returns on equity than the 23.8% we have actually averaged. Even in 1965, perhaps we could have judged there to be a 99% probability that higher leverage will lead to nothing but good. Correspondingly, we might have seen only a 1% chance that some shock factor, external or internal, would cause a conventional debt ratio to produce a result falling somewhere between temporary anguish and default. We wouldn't have liked those 99-to-1 odds and never will. A small chance of distress or disgrace cannot, in our view, be offset by a large chance of extra returns. If your actions are sensible, you are certain to get good results. In most such cases, leverage just moves things along faster. Charlie and I have never been in a big hurry. We enjoy the process far more than the proceeds, though we have learned to live with those also. Life and debt. Except for token amounts, we shun debt, turning to it for only three purposes. 1. We occasionally use repos as a part of certain short-term investing strategies that incorporate ownership of U.S. government or agency securities. Purchases of this kind are highly opportunistic and involve only the most liquid of securities. 2. We borrow money against portfolios of interest-bearing receivables whose risk characteristics we understand. 3. Subsidiaries, such as Berkshire Hathaway Energy, may incur debt that appears on Berkshire's consolidated balance sheet, but Berkshire does not guarantee the obligation. From a risk standpoint, it is far safer to have earnings from 10 diverse and uncorrelated utility operations that cover interest charges by, say, a 2-to-1 ratio, than it is to have far greater coverage provided by a single utility. A catastrophic event can render a single utility insolvent. Witness what Katrina did to the local electric utility in New Orleans. No matter how conservative its debt policy, a geographical disaster, say an earthquake in a western state, can't have the same effect on Mid-American. And even a worrier like Charlie can't think of an event that would systemically decrease utility earnings in any major way. Because of Mid-America's ever-widening diversity of regulated earnings, it will always utilize major amounts of debt. And that's about it. We are not interested in incurring any significant debt at Berkshire for acquisitions or operating purposes. Conventional business wisdom, of course, would argue that we are being too conservative and that there are added profits that could be safely earned if we injected moderate leverage into our balance sheet. Maybe so. but many of Berkshire's hundreds of thousands of investors have a large portion of their net worth in our stock. Among them, it should be emphasized, a large number of our board and key managers. And a disaster for the company would be a disaster for them. Moreover, these are people who have been permanently injured to whom we owe insurance payments that stretch out for 50 years or more. To these and other constituencies, we have promised total security, whatever comes. Financial panics, stock exchange closures, an extended one occurred in 1914, or even domestic nuclear, chemical, or biological attacks. We are quite willing to accept huge risks. Indeed, more than any other insurer, we write high-limit policies that are tied to single catastrophic events. We also own a large investment portfolio whose market value could fall dramatically and quickly under certain conditions, as happened on October 19, 1987. Whatever occurs, though, Berkshire will have the net worth, the earning streams, and the liquidity to handle the problems with ease. And any other approach is dangerous. Over the years, a number of very smart people have learned the hard way that a long string of impressive numbers multiplied by a single zero always equals zero. That is not an equation whose effects I would like to experience personally, and I would like even less to be responsible for imposing its penalties upon others. Unquestionably, some people have become very rich through the use of borrowed money. However, that's also been a way to get very poor. When leverage works, it magnifies your gains. Your spouse thinks you're clever, and your neighbors get envious. But leverage is addictive. Once having profited from its wonders, very few people retreat to more conservative practices. And, to repeat, as we all learned in third grade, and some relearned in 2008, any series of positive numbers, however impressive the numbers may be, evaporates when multiplied by a single zero. History tells us that leverage all too often produces zeros, even when it is employed by very smart people. Leverage, of course, can be lethal to businesses as well. Companies with large debts often assume that these obligations can be refinanced as they mature. That assumption is usually valid. Occasionally, though, either because of company-specific problems or a worldwide shortage of credit, maturities must actually be met by payment. For that, only cash will do the job. Borrowers then learn that credit is like oxygen. When either is abundant, its presence gets unnoticed. When either is missing, that's all that is noticed. Even a short absence of credit can bring a company to its knees. In September 2008, in fact, its overnight disappearance in many sectors of the economy came dangerously close to bringing our entire country to its knees. At Berkshire, we will hold at least $10 billion of cash, excluding that held by our regulated utility and railroad businesses. Because of that commitment, we customarily keep at least $20 billion on hand so that we both withstand unprecedented insurance losses, our largest to date having been about $3 billion from Katrina, the insurance industry's most expensive catastrophe, and quickly seize acquisition or investment opportunities even during times of financial turmoil. We keep our cash largely in U.S. Treasury bills and avoid other short-term securities yielding a few more basis points, a policy we adhered to long before the frailties of commercial paper and money market funds became apparent in September 2008. We agree with investment writer Ray DeVoe's observation, more money has been lost reaching for yield than at the point of a gun. At Berkshire, we don't rely on bank lines and we don't enter into contracts that could require postings of collateral except for amounts that are tiny in relation to our liquid assets. By being so cautious in respect to leverage, we penalize our returns by a minor amount. Having loads of liquidity, though, lets us sleep well. Moreover, during the episodes of financial chaos that occasionally erupt in our economy, we will be equipped both financially and emotionally to play offense while others scramble for survival. That's what allowed us to invest $15.6 billion in 25 days of panic following the Lehman bankruptcy in 2008. Investment alternatives. In addition to our permanent common stock holdings, we hold large quantities of marketable securities in our insurance companies. In selecting these, we can choose among 5 major categories. 1. Long-term common stock investments. 2. Medium-term fixed income securities. 3. Long-term fixed income securities. 4. Short-term cash equivalents. And 5. Short-term arbitrage commitments, as discussed in the essay Arbitrage in Part 2C. We have no particular bias when it comes to choosing from these categories. We just continuously search among them for the highest after-tax returns as measured by mathematical expectation, limiting ourselves always to investment alternatives we think we understand. Our criteria have nothing to do with maximizing immediately reportable earnings. Our goal, rather, is to maximize eventual net worth. Surveying the field. Investment possibilities are both many and varied. There are three major categories, however, and it's important to understand the characteristics of each, so let's survey the field. Investments that are denominated in a given currency include money market funds, bonds, mortgages, bank deposits, and other instruments. Most of these currency-based investments are thought of as safe. In truth, they are among the most dangerous of assets. Their beta may be zero, but their risk is huge. Over the past century, these instruments have destroyed the purchasing power of investors in many countries, even as the holders continue to receive timely payments of interest and principal. This ugly result, moreover, will forever recur. Governments determine the ultimate value of money, and systemic forces will sometimes cause them to gravitate to policies that produce inflation. From time to time, such policies spin out of control. Even in the U.S., where the wish for a stable currency is strong, the dollar has fallen a staggering 86% in value since 1965, when I took over management of Berkshire. It takes no less than $7 today to buy what $1 did at that time. Consequently, a tax-free institution would have needed 4.3% annually from bond investments over that period to simply maintain its purchasing power. Its managers would have been kidding themselves if they thought of any portion of that interest as income. For tax-paying investors, the picture has been far worse. During the same 47-year period, continuous rolling of U.S. Treasury bills produced 5.7% annually. That sounds satisfactory. But if an individual investor paid personal income taxes at a rate averaging 25%, this 5.7% return would have yielded nothing in the way of real income. This investor's visible income tax would have stripped him of 1.4 points of the stated yield, and the invisible inflation tax would have been devoured the remaining 4.3 points. It's noteworthy that the implicit inflation tax was more than triple the explicit income tax that our investor probably thought of as his main burden. "In God we trust" may be imprinted on our currency, but the hand that activates our government's printing press has been all too human. High interest rates, of course, can compensate purchasers for the inflation risk they face with currency-based investments, and indeed, rates in the early 1980s did that job nicely. Current rates, however, do not come close to offsetting the purchasing power risk that investors assume. Right now, bonds should come with a warning label. Under today's conditions, therefore, I do not like currency-based investments. Even so, Berkshire holds significant amounts of them, primarily of the short-term variety. At Berkshire, the need for ample liquidity occupies center stage and will never be slighted, however inadequate rates may be. Accommodating this need, we primarily hold U.S. Treasury bills, the only investment that can be counted on for liquidity under the most chaotic of economic conditions. Our working level for liquidity is $20 billion. $10 billion is our absolute minimum. Beyond the requirements that liquidity and regulators impose on us, we will purchase currency-related securities only if they offer the possibility of unusual gain, either because a particular credit is mispriced, as can occur in periodic junk bond debacles, or because rates rise to a level that offers the possibility of realizing substantial capital gains on high-grade bonds when rates fall. Though we've exploited both opportunities in the past and may do so again, we are now 180 degrees removed from such prospects. Today, a wry comment that Wall Streeter Shelby Cullom Davis made long ago seems apt. Bonds promoted as offering risk-free returns are now priced to deliver return-free risk. The second major category of investments involves assets that will never produce anything, but that are purchased in the buyer's hope that someone else, who also knows that the assets will be forever unproductive, will pay more for them in the future. Tulips, of all things, briefly became a favorite of such buyers in the 17th century. This type of investment requires an expanding pool of buyers who, in turn, are enticed because they believe the buying pool will expand still further. Owners are not inspired by what the asset itself can produce, it will remain lifeless forever, but rather by the belief that others will desire it even more avidly in the future. The major asset in this category is gold, currently a huge favorite of investors who fear almost all other assets, especially paper money, of whose value, as noted, they are right to be fearful. Gold, however, has two significant shortcomings, being neither much use nor procreative. True, gold has some industrial and decorative utility, but the demand for these purposes is both limited and incapable of soaking up new production. Meanwhile, if you own 1 ounce of gold for an eternity, you will still own 1 ounce at its end. What motivates most gold purchasers is their belief that the ranks of the fearful will grow. During the past decade, that belief has proved correct. Beyond that, the rising price has on its own generated additional buying enthusiasm, attracting purchasers who see the rise as validating an investment thesis. As bandwagon investors join any party, they create their own truth for a while. Over the past 15 years, both internet stocks and houses have demonstrated the extraordinary excess that can be created by combining an initially sensible thesis with well-publicized rising prices. In these bubbles, an army of originally skeptical investors succumbed to the proof delivered by the market, and the pool of buyers, for a time, expanded sufficiently to keep the bandwagon rolling. But bubbles blown large enough inevitably pop. Today, the world's gold stock is about 170,000 metric tons. If all of this gold were melded together, it would form a cube of about 68 feet per side. Picture it fitting comfortably within a baseball field. At $1,750 per ounce, gold's price, as I write this, its value would be $9.6 trillion. Call this cube pile A. Let's now create a pile B costing an equal amount. For that, we could buy all U.S. cropland, 400 million acres, with output of about $200 billion annually, plus 16 ExxonMobils, the world's most profitable company, one earning more than $40 billion annually. After these purchases, we would have about $1 trillion left over for walking around money, no sense feeling strapped after this buying binge. Can you imagine an investor with $9.6 trillion selecting pile A over pile B? Beyond the staggering valuation given the existing stock of gold, current prices make today's annual production of gold command about $160 billion. Buyers, whether jewelry and industrial users, frightened individuals, or speculators, must continually absorb this additional supply to merely maintain an equilibrium at present prices. A century from now, the 400 million acres of farmland will have produced staggering amounts of corn, wheat, cotton, and other crops, and will continue to produce that valuable bounty, whatever the currency may be. ExxonMobil will probably have delivered trillions of dollars in dividends to its owners and will also hold assets worth many more trillions, and remember, you get 16 Exxons. The 170,000 tons of gold will be unchanged in size and still incapable of producing anything. You can fondle the cube, but it will not respond. Admittedly, when people a century from now are fearful, it's likely many will still rush to gold. I'm confident, however, that the $9.6 trillion current valuation of Pile A will compound over the century at a rate far inferior to that achieved by Pile B. Our first two categories enjoy maximum popularity at peaks of fear. Terror over economic collapse drives individuals to currency-based assets, most particularly U.S. obligations, and fear of currency collapse fosters movement to sterile assets such as gold. We heard cash is king in late 2008, just when cash should have been deployed rather than held. Similarly, we heard cash is trash in the early 1980s, just when fixed dollar investments were at their most attractive level in memory. On those occasions, investors who required a supportive crowd paid dearly for that comfort. My own preference, and you knew this was coming, is our third category, investment in productive assets, whether businesses, farms, or real estate. Ideally, these assets should have the ability in inflationary times to deliver output that will retain its purchasing power value while requiring a minimum of new capital investment. Farms, real estate, and many businesses such as Coca-Cola, IBM, and our own See's Candy meet that double-barreled test. Certain other companies, think of our regulated utilities for example, fail it because inflation places heavy capital requirements on them. To earn more, their owners must invest more. Even so, these investments will remain superior to non-productive or currency-based assets. Whether the currency a century from now is based on gold, seashells, shark teeth, or a piece of paper as today, people will be willing to exchange a couple of minutes of their daily labor for a Coca-Cola or some C's peanut brittle. In the future, the U.S. population will move more goods, consume more food, and require more living space than it does now. People will forever exchange what they produce for what others produce. Our country's businesses will continue to efficiently deliver goods and services wanted by our own citizens. Metaphorically, these commercial cows will live for centuries and give ever greater quantities of milk to boot. Their value will be determined not by the medium of exchange, but rather by their capacity to deliver milk. Proceeds from the sale of the milk will compound for the owners of the cows, just as they did during the 20th century when the Dow increased from 66 to 11,497 and paid loads of dividends as well. Berkshire's goal will be to increase its ownership of first-class businesses. Our first choice will be to own them in their entirety, but we will also be owners by way of holding sizable amounts of marketable stocks. I believe that over any extended period of time, this category of investing will prove to be the runaway winner among the three we've examined. More important, it will be by far the safest. Junk bonds and the dagger thesis. Investing in junk bonds and investing in stocks are alike in certain ways. Both activities require us to make a price-value calculation and also to scan hundreds of securities to find the very few that have attractive reward-risk ratios. But there are important differences between the two disciplines as well. In stocks, we expect every commitment to work out well because we concentrate on conservatively financed businesses with competitive strengths run by able and honest people. If we buy into these companies at sensible prices, losses should be rare. Indeed, during the 38 years we have run the company's affairs, gains from the equities we manage at Berkshire, that is, excluding those managed at General Re and Geico, have exceeded losses by a ratio of about 100 to 1. Purchasing junk bonds, we are dealing with enterprises that are far more marginal. These businesses are usually overloaded with debt and often operate in industries characterized by low returns on capital. Additionally, the quality of management is sometimes questionable. Management may even have interests that are directly counter to those of debt holders. Therefore, we expect that we will have occasional large losses in junk issues. So far, however, we have done reasonably well in this field. Lethargy bordering on sloth remains the cornerstone of our investment style. This year, we neither bought nor sold a share of 5 of our 6 major holdings. The exception was Wells Fargo, a superbly managed, high-return banking operation in which we increased our ownership to just under 10%. The most we can own without the approval of the Federal Reserve Board. About 1/6 of our position was bought in 1989, the rest in 1990. By 2015, Berkshire owned approximately 25% of Wells Fargo's outstanding common stock. The banking business is no favorite of ours. When assets are 20 times equity, a common ratio in this industry, mistakes that involve only a small portion of assets can destroy a major portion of equity. And mistakes have been the rule rather than the exception at many major banks. Most have resulted from a managerial failing that we call the institutional imperative, the tendency of executives to mindlessly imitate the behavior of their peers, no matter how foolish it may be to do so. In their lending, many bankers played follow the leader with lemming-like zeal. Now they are experiencing a lemming-like fate. Because leverage of 20 to 1 magnifies the effects of managerial strengths and weaknesses, we have no interest in purchasing shares of a poorly managed bank at a cheap price. Instead, our only interest is in buying into well-managed banks at fair prices. With Wells Fargo, we think we have obtained the best managers in the business, Carl Reichart and Paul Hazen. In many ways, the combination of Carl and Paul reminds me of another, Tom Murphy and Dan Burke at Capital Cities ABC. First, each pair is stronger than the sum of its parts because each partner understands, trusts, and admires the other. Second, both managerial teams pay able people well, but abhor having a bigger headcount than is needed. Third, both attack costs as vigorously when profits are at record levels as when they are under pressure. Finally, both stick with what they understand and let their abilities, not their egos, determine what they attempt. Thomas J. Watson Sr. of IBM followed the same rule. "I'm no genius," he said. "I'm smart in spots, but I stay around those spots." Our purchases of Wells Fargo in 1990 were helped by a chaotic market in bank stocks. The disarray was appropriate. Month by month, the foolish loan decisions of once well-regarded banks were put on public display. As one huge loss after another was unveiled, often on the heels of managerial assurances that all was well, investors understandably concluded that no bank's numbers were to be trusted. Aided by their flight from bank stocks, we purchased our 10% interest in Wells Fargo for $290 million, less than 5 times after-tax earnings, and less than 3 times pre-tax earnings. Wells Fargo is big. It has $56 billion in assets and has been earning more than 20% on equity and 1.25% on assets. Our purchase of 1/10 of the bank may be thought of as roughly equivalent to our buying 100% of a $5 billion bank with identical financial characteristics. But were we to make such a purchase, we would have to pay about twice the $290 million we paid for Wells Fargo. Moreover, that $5 billion bank commanding a premium price would present us with another problem. We would not be able to find a Kyle Reichardt to run it. In recent years, Wells Fargo executives have been more avidly recruited than any others in the banking business. No one, however, has been able to hire the dean. Of course, ownership of a bank, or about any other business, is far from riskless. California banks face the specific risk of a major earthquake, which might wreak enough havoc on borrowers to in turn destroy the banks lending to them. A second risk is systemic, the possibility of a business contraction or financial panic so severe that it would endanger almost every highly leveraged institution, no matter how intelligently run. Finally, the market's major fear of the moment is that West Coast real estate values will tumble because of overbuilding and deliver huge losses to banks that have financed the expansion. Because it is a leading real estate lender, Wells Fargo is thought to be particularly vulnerable. None of these eventualities can be ruled out. The probability of the first two occurring, however, is low, and even a meaningful drop in real estate values is unlikely to cause major problems for well-managed institutions. Consider some mathematics. Wells Fargo currently earns well over $1 billion pre-tax annually after expensing more than $300 million for loan losses. If 10% of all $48 billion of the bank's loans, not just its real estate loans, were hit by problems in 1991, and these produced losses, including foregone interest, averaging 30% of principal, the company would roughly break even. A year like that, which we consider only a low-level possibility, not a likelihood, would not distress us. In fact, at Berkshire, we would love to acquire businesses or invest in capital projects that produce no return for a year, but that could then be expected to earn 20% on growing equity. Nevertheless, fears of a California real estate disaster similar to that experienced in New England caused the price of Wells Fargo stock to fall almost 50% within a few months during 1990. Even though we had bought some shares at the prices prevailing before the fall, we welcomed the decline because it allowed us to pick up many more shares at the new panic prices. We will be buying businesses or small parts of businesses called stocks year in, year out as long as I live, and longer if Berkshire's directors attend the seances I have scheduled. Given these intentions, declining prices for businesses benefit us and rising prices hurt us. The most common cause of low prices is pessimism, sometimes pervasive, sometimes specific to a company or industry. We want to do business in such an environment, not because we like pessimism, but because we like the prices it produces. It's optimism that is the enemy of the rational buyer. None of this means, however, that a business or stock is an intelligent purchase simply because it is unpopular. A contrarian approach is just as foolish as a follow-the-crowd strategy. What's required is thinking rather than polling. Unfortunately, Bertrand Russell's observation about life in general applies with unusual force in the financial world. Most men would rather die than think. Many do. Our other major portfolio change last year was large additions to our holdings of RJR Nabisco bonds, securities that we first bought in 1989. At year-end 1990, we had $440 million invested in these securities, an amount that approximated market value. As I write this, however, their market value has risen by more than $150 million. Just as buying into the banking business is unusual for us, so is the purchase of below investment-grade bonds. But opportunities that interest us and that are also large enough to have a worthwhile impact on Berkshire's results are rare. Therefore, we will look at any category of investment so long as we understand the businesses we're buying into and believe that price and value may differ significantly. Woody Allen, in another context, pointed out the advantage of open-mindedness. I can't understand why more people aren't bisexual because it doubles your chances for a date on Saturday night. In the past, we have bought a few below investment-grade bonds with success, though these were all old-fashioned fallen angels, bonds that were initially of investment grade but that were downgraded when the issuers fell on bad times. A kind of bastardized fallen angel burst onto the investment scene in the 1980s, junk bonds that were far below investment grade when issued. As the decade progressed, new offerings of manufactured junk became even junkier, and ultimately the predictable outcome occurred. Junk bonds lived up to their name. In 1990, even before the recession dealt its blows, the financial sky became dark with the bodies of falling corporations. The disciples of debt assured us that this collapse wouldn't happen. Huge debt, we were told, would cause operating managers to focus their efforts as never before, much as a dagger mounted on the steering wheel of a car could be expected to make its driver proceed with intensified care. We'll acknowledge that such an attention-getter would produce a very alert driver. But another certain consequence would be a deadly and unnecessary accident if the car hit even the tiniest pothole or sliver of ice. The roads of businesses are riddled with potholes. A plan that requires dodging them all is a plan for disaster. In the final chapter of The Intelligent Investor, Ben Graham forcefully rejected the dagger thesis. Confronted with the challenge to distill the secret of sound investment into 3 words, we venture the motto, margin of safety. 42 years after reading that, I still think those are the right 3 words. The failure of investors to heed this simple message caused them staggering losses as the 1990s began. At the height of the debt mania, capital structures were concocted that guaranteed failure. In some cases, so much debt was issued that even highly favorable businesses' results could not produce the funds to service it. One particularly egregious kill-'em-at-birth case a few years back, involved the purchase of a mature television station in Tampa bought with so much debt that the interest on it exceeded the station's gross revenues. Even if you assume that all labor, programs, and services were donated rather than purchased, this capital structure required revenues to explode, or else the station was doomed to go broke. Many of the bonds that financed the purchase were sold to now failed savings and loan associations. As a taxpayer, you were picking up the tab for this folly. All of this seems impossible now. When these misdeeds were done, however, dagger-selling investment bankers pointed to the scholarly research of academics, which reported that over the years the higher interest rates received from low-grade bonds had more than compensated for their higher rate of default. Thus, said the friendly salesman, a diversified portfolio of junk bonds would produce greater net returns than would a portfolio of high-grade bonds. Beware of past performance proofs in finance. If history books were the key to riches, the Forbes 400 would consist of librarians. There was a flaw in the salesman's logic, one that a first-year student in statistics is taught to recognize. An assumption was being made that the universe of newly minted junk bonds was identical to the universe of low-grade fallen angels, and that, therefore, the default experience of the latter group was meaningful in predicting the default experience of the new issues. That was an error similar to checking the historical death rate from Kool-Aid before drinking the version served at Jonestown. The universes were, of course, dissimilar in several vital respects. For openers, the manager of a fallen angel almost invariably yearned to regain investment-grade status and worked toward that goal. The junk bond operator was usually an entirely different breed. Behaving much as a heroin user might, he devoted his energies not to finding a cure for his debt-ridden condition, but rather to finding another fix. Additionally, the fiduciary sensitivities of the executives managing the typical fallen angel were often, though not always, more finely developed than were those of the junk bond issuing financiopath. Wall Street cared little for such distinctions. As usual, the street's enthusiasm for an idea was proportional not to its merit, but rather to the revenue it would produce. Mountains of junk bonds were sold by those who didn't care to those who didn't think, and there was no shortage of either. Junk bonds remain a minefield, even at prices that today are often a small fraction of issue price. As we said last year, we have never bought a new issue of a junk bond. The only time to buy these is on a day with no Y in it. We are, however, willing to look at the field now that it is in disarray. In the case of RJR Nabisco, we feel the company's credit is considerably better than was generally perceived for a while, and that the yield we receive, as well as the potential for capital gain, more than compensates for the risk we incur, though that is far from nil. RJR has made asset sales at favorable prices, has added major amounts of equity, and in general is being well run. However, as we survey the field, most low-grade bonds will look unattractive. The handiwork of the Wall Street of the 1980s is even worse than we had thought. Many important businesses have been mortally wounded. We will, though, keep looking for opportunities as the junk market continues to unravel. It is interesting to compare Wesco's approach, deliberate non-diversification of investments in an attempt to be more skillful per transaction, with an approach promoted for years by Michael Milken to help sell junk bonds. The Milken approach, supported by theories of many finance professors, argued that 1. Market prices were efficient in a world where investors get paid extra for enduring volatility, wide swings in outcomes. 2. Therefore, the prices at which new issues of junk bonds came to market were fair in a probabilistic sense, meaning that the high promised interest rates covered increased statistical expectancy of loss and also provided some premium return to cover volatility exposure. And 3, therefore, if a savings and loan association or other institution arranged diversification, say by buying, without much examination, a large part of each new Milken issue of junk bonds, the association would work itself into the sure-to-get-better-than-average results position of a gambling house proprietor with a house edge. This type of theorizing has now wreaked havoc at institutions governed by true believers, which backed their conclusions by buying Milken's bonds. Contrary to the theorizing, widely diversified purchases of such bonds have in most cases produced dismal results. We can all understand why Milken behaved as he did and believed what he had to believe in order to maintain an endurable self-image. But how can we explain why anyone else believed that Milken was paid 5% commissions to put bond buyers in the position of the house in Las Vegas? We suggest this cause. Many of the foolish buyers and their advisors were trained by finance professors who pushed beloved models, efficient market theory and modern portfolio theory, way too far, while they ignored other models that would have warned of danger. This is a common type of expert error. Zero coupon bonds and ski masks. Berkshire issued $902.6 million of principal amount of zero-coupon convertible subordinated debentures, which are now listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Salomon Brothers handled the underwriting in superb fashion, providing us helpful advice and a flawless execution. Most bonds, of course, require regular payments of interest, usually semi-annually. A zero-coupon bond, conversely, requires no current interest payments. Instead, the investor receives his yield by purchasing the security at a significant discount from maturity value. The effective interest rate is determined by the original issue price, the maturity value, and the amount of time between issuance and maturity. In our case, the bonds were issued at 44.314% of maturity value and are due in 15 years. For investors purchasing the bonds, that is the mathematical equivalent of a 5.5% current payment compounded semi-annually. Because we received only 44.31 cents on the dollar, our proceeds from this offering were $400 million, less about $9.5 million of offering expenses. The bonds were issued in denominations of $10,000, and each bond is convertible into 0.4515 shares of Berkshire Hathaway. Because a $10,000 bond cost $4,431, this means that the conversion price was about $9,815 per Berkshire share, a 15% premium to the market price then existing. Berkshire can call the bonds at any time after September 28, 1992, at their accreted value, the original issue price plus 5.5% compounded semi-annually, and on two specified days, September 28 of 1994 and 1999, the bondholders can require Berkshire to buy the securities at their accreted value. For tax purposes, Berkshire is entitled to deduct the 5.5% interest accrual each year, even though we make no payments to the bondholders. Thus, the net effect to us resulting from the reduced taxes is positive cash flow. That is a very significant benefit. Some unknowable variables prevent us from calculating our exact effective rate of interest, but under all circumstances, it will be well below 5.5%. There is, meanwhile, a symmetry to the tax law. Any taxable holder of the bonds must pay tax each year on the 5.5% interest, even though he receives no cash. Neither our bonds nor those of certain other companies that issued similar bonds last year, notably Lowe's and Motorola, resemble the great bulk of zero-coupon bonds that have been issued in recent years. Of these, Charlie and I have been and will continue to be outspoken critics. As I will later explain, such bonds have often been used in the most deceptive of ways and with deadly consequences to investors. But before we tackle that subject, let's travel back to Eden, to a time when the apple had not yet been bitten. If you're my age, you bought your first zero-coupon bonds during World War II by purchasing the famous Series E U.S. savings bond, the most widely sold bond issue in history. After the war, these bonds were held by 1 out of 2 U.S. households. Nobody, of course, called the Series E a zero-coupon bond, a term, in fact, that I doubt had been invented. But that's precisely what the Series E was. These bonds came in denominations as small as $18.75. That amount purchased a $25 obligation of the United States government due in 10 years, terms that gave the buyer a compounded annual rate of 2.9%. At the time, this was an attractive offer. The 2.9% rate was higher than that generally available on government bonds, and the holder faced no market fluctuation risk, since he could at any time cash in his bonds with only a minor reduction in interest. A second form of zero-coupon U.S. Treasury issue, also benign and useful, surfaced in the last decade. One problem with a normal bond is that even though it pays a given interest rate, say 10%, the holder cannot be assured that a compounded 10% return will be realized. For that rate to materialize, each semi-annual coupon must be reinvested at 10% as it is received. If current interest rates are, say, only 6% or 7% when these coupons come due, the holder will be unable to compound his money over the life of the bond at the advertised rate. For pension funds or other investors with long-term liabilities, reinvestment risk of this type can be a serious problem. Savings bonds might have solved it, except that they are issued only to individuals and are unavailable in large denominations. What big buyers needed was huge quantities of savings bond equivalents. Enter some ingenious and, in this case, highly useful investment bankers led, I'm happy to say, by Salomon Brothers. They created the instrument desired by stripping the semi-annual coupons from standard government issues. Each coupon, once detached, takes on the essential character of a savings bond since it represents a single sum due sometime in the future. For example, if you strip the 40 semi-annual coupons from a U.S. government bond due in the year 2010, you will have 40 zero-coupon bonds with maturities from 6 months to 20 years, each of which can then be bundled with other coupons of like maturity and marketed. If current interest rates are, say, 10% for all maturities, the 6-month issue will sell for 95.24% of maturity value, and the 20-year issue will sell for 14.20%. The purchaser of any given maturity is thus guaranteed a compounded rate of 10% for his entire holding period. Stripping of government bonds has occurred on a large scale in recent years as long-term investors, ranging from pension funds to individual IRA accounts, recognized these high-grade, zero-coupon issues to be well-suited for their needs. But as happens in Wall Street all too often, what the wise do in the beginning, fools do in the end. In the last few years, zero-coupon bonds and their functional equivalent, pay-in-kind bonds, which distribute additional PIK bonds semi-annually as interest instead of paying cash, have been issued in enormous quantities by even junkier credits. To these issuers, zero or PIK bonds offer one overwhelming advantage: it is impossible to default on a promise to pay nothing. Indeed, if LDC governments had issued no debt in the 1970s other than long-term zero-coupon obligations, they would now have a spotless record as debtors. This principle at work, that you need not default for a long time if you solemnly promise to pay nothing for a long time, has not been lost on promoters and investment bankers seeking to finance ever shakier deals. But its acceptance by lenders took a while. When the leveraged buyout craze began some years back, purchasers could borrow only on a reasonably sound basis, in which conservatively estimated free cash flow, that is, operating earnings plus depreciation and amortization less normalized capital expenditures, was adequate to cover both interest and modest reductions in debt. Later, as the adrenaline of dealmakers surged, businesses began to be purchased at prices so high that all free cash flow necessarily had to be allocated to the payment of interest. That left nothing for the paydown of debt. In effect, a Scarlett O'Hara "I'll think about it tomorrow" position in respect to principal payments was taken by borrowers and accepted by a new breed of lender, the buyer of original issue junk bonds. Debt now became something to be refinanced rather than repaid. The change brings to mind a New Yorker cartoon in which the grateful borrower rises to shake the hand of the bank's lending officer and gushes, "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Soon borrowers found even the new, lax standards intolerably binding. To induce lenders to finance even sillier transactions, they introduced an abomination, EBDIT, earnings before depreciation, interest, and taxes, as the test of a company's ability to pay interest. Using this sawed-off yardstick, the borrower ignored depreciation as an expense on the theory that it did not require a current cash outlay. Such an attitude is clearly delusional. At 95% of American businesses, capital expenditures that over time roughly approximate depreciation are a necessity and are every bit as real an expense as labor or utility costs. Even a high school dropout knows that to finance a car, he must have income that covers not only interest and operating expenses, but also realistically calculated depreciation. He would be laughed out of the bank if he started talking about EBDIT. Capital outlays at a business can be skipped, of course, in any given month, just as a human can skip a day or even a week of eating. But if the skipping becomes routine and is not made up, the body weakens and eventually dies. Furthermore, a start and stop feeding policy will over time produce a less healthy organism, human or corporate, than that produced by a steady diet. As businessmen, Charlie and I relish having competitors who are unable to fund capital expenditures. You might think that waving away a major expense such as depreciation in an attempt to make a terrible deal look like a good one hits the limits of Wall Street's ingenuity. If so, you haven't been paying attention during the past few years. Promoters needed to find a way to justify even pricier acquisitions. Otherwise, they risked, heaven forbid, losing deals to the other promoters with more imagination. So, stepping through the looking glass, promoters and their investment bankers proclaimed that EBDIT should now be measured against cash interest only, which meant that interest accruing on zero-coupon or PIK bonds could be ignored when the financial feasibility of a transaction was being assessed. This approach not only relegated depreciation expense to the let's ignore it corner, but gave similar treatment to what was usually a significant portion of interest expense. To their shame, many professional investment managers went along with this nonsense, though they usually were careful to do so only with clients' money and not their own. Calling these managers professionals is actually too kind. They should be designated promotees. Under this new standard, a business earning, say, $100 million pre-tax and having debt on which $90 million of interest must be paid currently might use a zero coupon of PIK issue to incur another $60 million of annual interest that would accrue and compound but not come due for some years. The rate on these issues would typically be very high, which means that the situation in year 2 might be $90 million cash interest plus $69 million accrued interest, and so on as the compounding proceeds. Such high-rate reborrowing schemes, which a few years ago were appropriately confined to the waterfront, soon became models of finance at virtually all major investment banking houses. When they make these offerings, investment bankers display their humorous side. They dispense income and balance sheet projections extending 5 or more years into the future for companies they barely had heard of a few months earlier. If you are shown such schedules, I suggest that you join the fun. Ask the investment banker for the 1-year budgets that his own firm prepared as the last few years began, and then compare these with what actually happened. Some time ago, Ken Galbraith, in his witty and insightful The Great Crash, coined a new economic term, the bezel, defined as the current amount of undiscovered embezzlement. This financial creature has a magical quality. The embezzlers are richer by the amount of the bezel, while the embezzlees do not yet feel poorer. Professor Galbraith astutely pointed out that this sum should be added to the national wealth so that we might know the psychic national wealth. Logically, a society that wanted to feel enormously prosperous would both encourage its citizens to embezzle and try not to detect the crime. By this means, wealth would balloon, though not an erg of productive work had been done. The satirical nonsense of the bezel is dwarfed by the real-world nonsense of the zero-coupon bond. With zeros, one party to a contract can experience income without his opposite experiencing the pain of expenditure. In our illustration, a company capable of earning only $100 million annually, and therefore capable of paying only that much in interest, magically creates earnings for bondholders of $150 million. As long as major investors willingly don their Peter Pan wings and repeatedly say, "I believe," there is no limit to how much income can be created by the zero-coupon bond. Wall Street welcomed this invention with the enthusiasm less enlightened folk might reserve for the wheel or the plow. Here, finally, was an instrument that would let the street make deals at prices no longer limited by actual earning power. The result, obviously, would be more transactions. Silly prices will always attract sellers. And, as Jesse Unruh might have put it, transactions are the mother's milk of finance. The zero-coupon or PIK bond possesses an additional attraction for the promoter and investment banker, which is that the time elapsing between folly and failure can be stretched out. This is no small benefit. If the period before all costs must be faced is long, promoters can create a string of foolish deals and take in lots of fees before any chickens come home to roost from their earlier ventures. But in the end, alchemy, whether it is metallurgical or financial, fails. A base business cannot be transformed into a golden business by tricks of accounting or capital structure. The man claiming to be a financial alchemist may become rich, but gullible investors rather than business achievements will usually be the source of his wealth. Whatever their weaknesses, we should add, many zero-coupon and PIK bonds will not default. We have in fact owned some and may buy more if their market becomes sufficiently distressed. We've not, however, even considered buying a new issue from a weak credit. No financial instrument is evil per se, it's just that some variations have far more potential for mischief than others. The blue ribbon for mischief-making should go to the zero-coupon issuer unable to make its interest payments on a current basis. Our advice, whenever an investment banker starts talking about EBDIT, or whenever someone creates a capital structure that does not allow all interest, both payable and accrued, to be comfortably met out of current cash flow net of ample capital expenditures, zip up your wallet. Turn the tables by suggesting that the promoter and his high-priced entourage accept zero-coupon fees, deferring their take until the zero-coupon bonds have been paid in full. See then how much enthusiasm for the deal endures. Our comments about investment bankers may seem harsh, but Charlie and I, in our hopelessly old-fashioned way, believe that they should perform a gatekeeping role, guarding investors against the promoter's propensity to indulge in excess. Promoters, after all, have throughout time exercised the same judgment and restraint in accepting money that alcoholics have exercised in accepting liquor. At a minimum, therefore, the banker's conduct should rise to that of a responsible bartender who, when necessary, refuses the profit from the next drink to avoid sending a drunk out on the highway. In recent years, unfortunately, many leading investment firms have found bartender morality to be an intolerably restrictive standard. Lately, those who have traveled by the high road in Wall Street have not encountered heavy traffic. One distressing footnote: the cost of the zero-coupon folly will not be borne solely by the direct participants. Certain savings and loan associations were heavy buyers of such bonds, using cash that came from FSLIC-insured deposits. Straining to show splendid earnings, these buyers recorded but did not receive ultra-high interest income on these issues. Many of these associations are now in major trouble. Had their loans to shaky credits worked, the owners of the associations would have pocketed the profits. In the many cases in which the loans will fail, the taxpayer will pick up the bill. To paraphrase Jackie Mason, at these associations it was the managers who should have been wearing the ski masks. Preferred stock. We only want to link up with people whom we like, admire, and trust. John Gutfreund at Solomon, Coleman Mockler Jr. at Gillette, Ed Kolodny at US Air, and Andy Sigler at Champion meet this test in spades. They in turn have demonstrated some confidence in us, insisting in each case that our preferreds have unrestricted voting rights on a fully converted basis, an arrangement that is far from standard in corporate finance. In effect, they are trusting us to be intelligent owners, thinking about tomorrow instead of today, just as we are trusting them to be intelligent managers, thinking about tomorrow as well as today. The preferred stock structures we have negotiated will provide a mediocre return for us if industry economics hinder the performance of our investees, but will produce reasonably attractive results for us if they can earn a return comparable to that of American industry in general. We believe that Gillette, under Coleman's management, will far exceed that return and believe that John, Ed, and Andy will reach it unless industry conditions are harsh. Under almost any conditions, we expect these preferreds to return us our money plus dividends. If that is all we get, though, the result will be disappointing because we will have given up flexibility and consequently will have missed some significant opportunities that are bound to present themselves during the decade. Under the scenario, we will have obtained only a preferred stock yield during a period when the typical preferred stock will have held no appeal for us whatsoever. The only way Berkshire can achieve satisfactory results from its 4 preferred issues is to have the common stocks of the investee companies do well. Good management and at least tolerable industry conditions will be needed if that is to happen. But we believe Berkshire's investment will also help and that the other shareholders of each investee will profit over the years ahead from our preferred stock purchase. The help will come from the fact that each company now has a major, stable, and interested shareholder whose chairman and vice chairman have, through Berkshire's investments, indirectly committed a very large amount of their own money to these undertakings. In dealing with our investees, Charlie and I will be supportive, analytical, and objective. We recognize that we are working with experienced CEOs who are very much in command of their own business, but who nevertheless, at certain moments, appreciate the chance to test their thinking on someone without ties to the industry or to decisions of the past. As a group, these convertible preferreds will not produce the returns we can achieve when we find a business with wonderful economic prospects that is unappreciated by the market. Nor will the returns be as attractive as those produced when we make our favorite form of capital deployment: the acquisition of 80% or more of a fine business with a fine management. But both opportunities are rare, particularly in a size befitting our present and anticipated resources. In summation, Charlie and I feel that our preferred stock investments should produce returns moderately above those achieved by most fixed income portfolios, and that we can play a minor but enjoyable and constructive role in the investee companies. Mistakes occur at the time of decision. We can only make our mistake du jour award, however, when the foolishness of a decision becomes obvious. By this measure, 1994 was a vintage year with keen competition for the gold medal. Here, I would like to tell you that the mistakes I will describe originated with Charlie, but whenever I try to explain things that way, my nose begins to grow. And the nominees are: late in 1993, I sold 10 million shares of Cap Cities at $63. At year-end 1994, the price was $85.25. The difference is $222.5 million for those of you who wish to avoid the pain of calculating the damage yourself. When we purchased the stock at $17.25 in 1986, I told you that I had previously sold our Cap Cities holdings at $4.30 per share during 1978 to 80, and added that I was at a loss to explain my earlier behavior. Now I have become a repeat offender. Maybe it's time to get a guardian appointed. Egregious as it is, the Cap City's decision earns only a silver medal. Top honors go to a mistake I made 5 years ago that fully ripened in 1994. Our $358 million purchase of U.S. Air preferred stock, on which the dividend was suspended in September. This deal was an unforced error, meaning that I was neither pushed into the investment nor misled by anyone when making it. Rather, this was a case of sloppy analysis, a lapse that may have been caused by the fact that we were buying a senior security or by hubris. Whatever the reason, the mistake was large. Before this purchase, I simply failed to focus on the problems that would inevitably beset a carrier whose costs were both high and extremely difficult to lower. In earlier years, these life-threatening costs posed few problems. Airlines were then protected from competition by regulation, and carriers could absorb high costs because they could pass them along by way of fares that were also high. When deregulation came along, it did not immediately change the picture. The capacity of low-cost carriers was so small that the high-cost lines could, in part, maintain their existing fare structures. During this period, with the longer-term problems largely invisible but slowly metastasizing, the costs that were non-sustainable became further embedded. As the seat capacity of the low-cost operators expanded, their fares began to force the old-line, high-cost airlines to cut their own. The day of reckoning for these airlines could be delayed by infusions of capital, such as ours into U.S. Air, but eventually a fundamental rule of economics prevailed. In an unregulated commodity business, a company must lower its cost to competitive levels or face extinction. This principle should have been obvious to your chairman, but I missed it. Seth Schofield, then CEO of U.S. Air, has worked diligently to correct the company's historical cost problems, but, to date, has not managed to do so. In part, this is because he has had to deal with a moving target, the result of certain major carriers having obtained labor concessions and other carriers having benefited from fresh start costs that came out of bankruptcy proceedings. As Herb Kelleher, CEO of Southwest Airlines, has said, bankruptcy court for airlines has become a health spa. Additionally, it should be no surprise to anyone that those airline employees who contractually receive above-market salaries will resist any reduction in these as long as their checks continue to clear. Despite this difficult situation, U.S. Air may yet achieve the cost reductions it needs to maintain its viability long-term, but it is far from sure that will happen. Accordingly, we wrote our U.S. Air investment down to $89.5 million, or 25 cents on the dollar, at year-end 1994. This valuation reflects both a possibility that our preferred will have its value fully or largely restored, and an opposite possibility that the stock will eventually become worthless. Whatever the outcome, we will heed a prime rule of investing. You don't have to make it back the way that you lost it. The accounting effects of our U.S. Air write-down are complicated. On our balance sheet, we carry all stocks at estimated market value. Therefore, at the end of last year's third quarter, we were carrying our U.S. Air preferred at $89.5 million, or 25% of cost. In other words, our net worth was at the time reflecting a value of U.S. Air that was far below our $358 million cost. But in the fourth quarter, we concluded that the decline in value was, in accounting terms, other than temporary, and that judgment required us to send the write-down of $268.5 million through our income statement. The amount had no other fourth quarter effect. That is, it did not reduce our net worth because the diminution of value had already been reflected there. Charlie and I will not stand for re-election to U.S. Air's board at the upcoming annual meeting. Should Seth wish to consult with us, however, we will be pleased to be of any help that we can. When Richard Branson, the wealthy owner of Virgin Atlantic Airways, was asked how to become a millionaire, he had a quick answer. There's really nothing to it. Start as a billionaire and then buy an airline. Unwilling to accept Branson's proposition on faith, your chairman decided in 1989 to test it by investing $358 million on a 9.25% preferred stock of U.S. Air. I liked and admired Ed Kolodny, the company's then CEO, and I still do. But my analysis of U.S. Air's business was both superficial and wrong. I was so beguiled by the company's long history of profitable operations and by the protection that ownership of a senior security seemingly offered me that I overlooked the crucial point. U.S. Air's revenues would increasingly feel the effects of an unregulated, fiercely competitive market, whereas its cost structure was a holdover from the days when regulation protected profits. These costs, if left unchecked, portended disaster, however reassuring the airline's past record might be. To rationalize its costs, however, U.S. Air needed major improvements in its labor contracts, and that's not something most airlines have found it extraordinarily difficult to get, short of credibly threatening or actually entering bankruptcy. U.S. Air was to be no exception. Immediately after we purchased our preferred stock, the imbalance between the company's costs and revenues began to grow explosively. In the 1990 to 1994 period, U.S. Air lost an aggregate of $2.4 billion, a performance that totally wiped out the book equity of its common stock. For much of this period, the company paid us our preferred dividends, but in 1994, payment was suspended. A bit later, with the situation looking particularly gloomy, we wrote down our investment by 75% to $89.5 million. Therefore, during much of 1995, I offered to sell our shares at 50% of face value. Fortunately, I was unsuccessful. Mixed in with my many mistakes at U.S. Air was one thing I got right. Making our investment, we wrote into the preferred contract a somewhat unusual provision stipulating that penalty dividends, to run 5 percentage points over the prime rate, would be accrued on any arrearages. This meant that when our 9.25% dividend was omitted for 2 years, the unpaid amounts compounded at rates ranging between 13.25% and 14%. Facing this penalty provision, U.S. Air had every incentive to pay arrearages just as promptly as it could. And in the second half of 1996, when U.S. Air turned profitable, it indeed began to pay, giving us $47.9 million. We owe Stephen Wolf, the company's CEO, a huge thank you for extracting a performance from the airline that permitted this payment. Even so, U.S. Air's performance has recently been helped significantly by an industry tailwind that may be cyclical in nature. The company still has basic cost problems that must be solved. In any event, the prices of U.S. Air's publicly traded securities tell us that our preferred stock is now probably worth its par value of $358 million, give or take a little. In addition, we have over the years collected an aggregate of $240.5 million in dividends, including $30 million received in 1997. Early in 1996, before any accrued dividends had been paid, I tried once more to unload our holdings, this time for about $335 million. You're lucky, I again failed in my attempt to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. In another context, a friend once asked me, "If you're so rich, why aren't you smart?" After reviewing my sorry performance with U.S. Air, you may conclude he had a point. In making the U.S. Air purchase, your chairman displayed exquisite timing. I plunged into the business at almost the exact moment that it had run into severe problems. No one pushed me. In tennis parlance, I committed an unforced error. The company's troubles were brought on both by industry conditions and by the post-merger difficulties it encountered in integrating Piedmont, an affliction I should have expected since almost all airline mergers have been followed by operational turmoil. In short order, Ed Kolodny and Seth Schofield resolved the second problem. The airline now gets excellent marks for service. Industry-wide problems have proved to be far more serious. Since our purchase, the economics of the airline industry have deteriorated at an alarming pace, accelerated by the kamikaze pricing tactics of certain carriers. The trouble this pricing has produced for all carriers illustrates an important truth. In a business selling a commodity-type product, it's impossible to be a lot smarter than your dumbest competitor. However, unless the industry is decimated during the next few years, our U.S. Air investment should work out all right. Ed and Seth decisively addressed the current turbulence by making major changes in operations. Even so, our investment is now less secure than at the time I made it. Our convertible preferred stocks are relatively simple securities, yet I should warn you that, if the past is any guide, you may from time to time read inaccurate or misleading statements about them. Last year, for example, several members of the press calculated the value of all our preferreds as equal to that of the common stock into which they are convertible. By their logic, that is, our Solomon preferred convertible into common at $38 would be worth 60% of face value if Solomon common were selling at $22.80. But there is a small problem with this line of reasoning. Using it, one must conclude that all of the value of a convertible preferred resides in the conversion privilege, and that value of a non-convertible preferred of Solomon would be zero, no matter what its coupon or terms for redemption. The point you should keep in mind is that most of the value of our convertible preferreds is derived from their fixed income characteristics. That means the securities cannot be worth less than the value they would possess as non-convertible preferreds, and may be worth more because of their conversion options. Berkshire made 5 private purchases of convertible preferred stocks during the 1987 to 91 period, and the time seems right to discuss their status. In each case, we had the option of sticking with these preferreds as fixed income securities or converting them into common stock. Initially, their value to us came primarily from their fixed income characteristics. The option we had to convert was a kicker. Our $300 million private purchase of American Express Perks was a modified form of common stock whose fixed income characteristics contributed only a minor portion of its intrinsic value. 3 years after we bought them, the Perks automatically were converted to common stock. In contrast, our other convertible preferred stocks were set to become common stocks only if we wished them to, a crucial difference. When we purchased our convertible securities, I told you that we expected to earn after-tax returns from them that moderately exceeded what we would earn from the medium-term fixed income securities they replaced. We beat this expectation, but only because of the performance of a single issue. I also told you that these securities, as a group, would not produce the returns we can achieve when we find a business with wonderful economic prospects. Unfortunately, that prediction was fulfilled. Finally, I said that under almost any conditions, we expect these preferreds to return us our money plus dividends. That's one I would like to have back. Winston Churchill once said that eating my words has never given me indigestion. My assertion, however, that it was almost impossible for us to lose money on our preferreds has caused me some well-deserved heartburn. Our best holding has been Gillette, which we told you from the start was a superior business. Ironically, though, this is also the purchase in which I made my biggest mistake, of a kind, however, never recognized on financial statements. We paid $600 million in 1989 for Gillette preferred shares that were convertible into 48 million split-adjusted common shares. Taking an alternative route with the $600 million, I probably could have purchased 60 million shares of common from the company. The market on the common was then about $10.50, and given that this would have been a huge private placement carrying important restrictions, I probably could have bought the stock at a discount of at least 5%. I can't be sure about this, but it's likely that Gillette's management would have been just as happy to have Berkshire opt for common. But I was far too clever to do that. Instead, for less than 2 years, we received some extra dividend income, the difference between the preferred's yield and that of the common, at which point the company quite properly called the issue, moving to do that as quickly as was possible. If I had negotiated for common rather than preferred, we would have been better off at year-end 1995 by $625 million, minus the excess dividends of about $70 million. In the case of Champion, the ability of the company to call our preferred at 115% of cost forced a move out of us last August that we would rather have delayed. In this instance, we converted our shares just prior to the pending call and offered them to the company at a modest discount. Charlie and I have never had a conviction about the paper industry. Actually, I can't remember ever owning the common stock of a paper producer in my 54 years of investing, so our choice in August was whether to sell in the market or to the company. Our company capital gain was moderate, about 19% after tax from a 6-year investment, but the preferred delivered us a good after-tax dividend yield throughout our holding period. That said, many press accounts have overstated the after-tax yields earned by property casualty insurance companies on dividends paid to them. What the press has failed to take into account is a change in the tax law that took effect in 1987 and that significantly reduced the dividends received credit applicable to insurers. Our first Empire preferred was to be called on March 31, 1996, the earliest date allowable. We are comfortable owning stock in well-run banks, and we will convert and keep our first Empire common shares. Bob Wilmers, CEO of the company, is an outstanding banker, and we love being associated with him. Our other two preferreds have been disappointing, though the Solomon preferred has modestly outperformed the fixed income securities for which it was a substitute. However, the amount of management time Charlie and I have devoted to this holding has been vastly greater than its economic significance to Berkshire. Certainly, I never dreamed I would take a new job at age 60, Solomon interim chairman, that is, because of an earlier purchase of a fixed income security. Soon after our purchase of the Solomon Preferred in 1987, I wrote that I had no special insights regarding the direction or future profitability of investment banking. Even the most charitable commentator would conclude that I have since proved my point. To date, our option to convert into Solomon Common has not proven of value. Furthermore, the Dow Industrials have doubled since I committed to buy the preferred, and the brokerage group has performed equally well. That means my decision to go with Solomon because I saw value in the conversion option must be graded as very poor. Even so, the preferred has continued under some trying conditions to deliver as a fixed income security, and the 9% dividend is currently quite attractive. Unless the preferred is converted, its term require redemption of 20% of the issue on October 31 of each year, 1995 to 1999, and $140 million of our original $700 million was taken on schedule last year. Some press reports labeled this a sale, but a senior security that matures is not sold. Though we did not elect to convert the preferred that matured last year, we have 4 more bites at the conversion apple, and I believe it quite likely that we will yet find value in our right to convert. The common stocks of both Gillette and First Empire, into which Berkshire's preferreds had been converted, have risen substantially in line with the company's excellent performance. At year-end, the $600 million we put into Gillette in 1989 had appreciated to $4.8 billion, and the $40 million we committed to First Empire in 1991 had risen to $236 million. Our 2 laggards, US Air and Solomon, meanwhile, have come to life in a very major way. In a transaction that finally rewarded its long-suffering shareholders, Solomon recently merged into Travelers Group. All of Berkshire's shareholders, including me very personally, owe a huge debt to Derek Maughan and Bob Denham for, first, playing key roles in saving Solomon from extinction following its 1991 scandal, and second, restoring the vitality of the company to a level that made it an attractive acquisition for travelers. I have often said that I wish to work with executives that I like, trust, and admire. No 2 fit that description better than Derek and Bob. Berkshire's final results from its Solomon investments won't be tallied for some time, but it is safe to say that they will be far better than I anticipated 2 years ago. Looking back, I think of my Solomon experience as having been both fascinating and instructional, though for a time in 1991 to 92, when serving as its chairman, I felt like the dramatic critic who wrote, "I would have enjoyed the play except I had an unfortunate seat. It faced the stage." The resuscitation of U.S. Airways borders on the miraculous. Those who have watched my moves in this investment know that I have compiled a record that is unblemished by success. I was wrong in originally purchasing the stock, and I was wrong later in repeatedly trying to unload our holdings at 50 cents on the dollar. 2 changes at the company coincided with this remarkable rebound. 1, Charlie and I left the board of directors, and 2, Stephen Wolf became CEO. Fortunately for our egos, the second event was the key. Stephen Wolf's accomplishments at the airline have been phenomenal. There still is much to do at U.S. Airways, but survival is no longer an issue. Consequently, the company made up the dividend arrearages on our preferred during 1997, adding extra payments to compensate us for the delay we suffered. The company's common stock, furthermore, has risen from a low of $4 to a recent high of $73. Our preferred has been called for redemption on March 15, but the rise in the company's stock has given our conversion rights, which we thought worthless not long ago, great value. It is now almost certain that our U.S. Airways shares will produce a decent profit, that is, if my cost for Maalox is excluded, and the gain could prove even indecent. Next time I make a big, dumb decision, Berkshire shareholders will know what to do. Phone Mr. Wolf. In addition to the convertible preferreds, we purchased 1 other private placement in 1991, $300 million of American Express perks. This security was essentially a common stock that featured a trade-off in its first 3 years. We received extra dividend payments during that period, but we were also capped in the price of appreciation we would realize. Despite the cap, this holding has proved extraordinarily profitable thanks to a move by your chairman that combined lack and skill, 110% luck, the balance skill. Our perks were due to convert into common stock in August 1994, and in the month before I was mulling whether to sell upon conversion. One reason to hold was Amex's outstanding CEO, Harvey Golub, who seemed likely to maximize whatever potential the company had, a supposition that has since proved in spades. But the size of that potential was in question. Amex faced relentless competition from a multitude of card issuers led by Visa. Weighing the arguments, I leaned towards sale. Here's where I got lucky. During that month of decision, I played golf at Prouts Neck, Maine, with Frank Olson, CEO of Hertz. Frank is a brilliant manager with intimate knowledge of the card business. So from the first tee on, I was quizzing him about the industry. By the time we reached the second green, Frank had convinced me that Amex's corporate card was a terrific franchise, and I had decided not to sell. On the back nine, I turned buyer, and in a few months, Berkshire owned 10% of the company. We now have a $3 billion gain in our Amex shares, and I naturally feel very grateful to Frank. But George Gillespie, our mutual friend, says that I am confused about where my gratitude should go. After all, he points out, it was he who arranged the game and assigned me to Frank's foursome. Derivatives. Charlie and I are of one mind in how we feel about derivatives and the trading activities that go with them. We view them as time bombs, both for the parties that deal in them and the economic system. Having delivered that thought, which I'll get back to, let me retreat to explaining derivatives, though the explanation must be general because the word covers an extraordinarily wide range of financial contracts. Essentially, these instruments call for money to change hands at some future date, with the amount to be determined by one or more reference items such as interest rates, stock prices, or currency values. If, for example, you are either long or short on S&P 500 futures contract, you are a party to a very simple derivatives transaction, with your gain or loss derived from movements in the index. Derivatives contracts are of varying duration, running sometimes to 20 or more years, and their value is often tied to several variables. Unless derivatives contracts are collateralized or guaranteed, their ultimate value also depends on the creditworthiness of the counterparties to them. In the meantime, though, before a contract is settled, the counterparties record profits and losses, often huge in amount, in their current earnings statements without so much as a penny changing hands. The range of derivatives contracts is limited only by the imagination of man, or sometimes, so it seems, madmen. At Enron, for example, newsprint and broadband derivatives due to be settled many years in the future were put on the books. Or say you want to write a contract speculating on the number of twins to be born in Nebraska in 2020. No problem. At a price, you will easily find an obliging counterparty. When we purchased Gen Re, it came with General Re Securities, a derivatives dealer that Charlie and I didn't want, judging it to be dangerous. We failed in our attempts to sell the operation, however, and now we are terminating it. But closing down a derivatives business is easier said than done. In fact, the reinsurance and derivatives businesses are similar. Like hell, both are easy to enter and almost impossible to exit. In either industry, once you write a contract which may require a large payment decades later, you are usually stuck with it. True, there are methods by which the risk can be laid off with others, but most strategies of that kind leave you with residual liability. Another commonality of reinsurance and derivatives is that both generate reported earnings that are often wildly overstated. That's true because today's earnings are in a significant way based on estimates whose inaccuracy may not be exposed for many years. Errors will usually be honest, reflecting only the human tendency to take an optimistic view of one's commitments. But the parties to derivatives also have enormous incentives to cheat in accounting for them. Those who trade derivatives are usually paid in whole or part on earnings calculated by mark-to-market accounting. But often there is no real market, think about our contract involving twins, and mark-to-model is utilized. This substitution can bring on large-scale mischief. As a general rule, contracts involving multiple reference items and distant settlement dates increase the opportunities for counterparties to use fanciful assumptions. In the twins scenario, for example, the two parties to the contract might well use differing models allowing both to show substantial profits for many years. In extreme cases, mark-to-model degenerates into what I would call mark-to-myth. Of course, both internal and outside auditors review the numbers, but that's no easy job. For example, General Reese Securities at year-end, after 10 months of winding down its operation, had 14,384 contracts outstanding, involving 672 counterparties around the world. Each contract had a plus or minus value derived from one or more reference items, including some of mind-boggling complexity. Valuing a portfolio like that, expert auditors could easily and honestly have widely varying opinions. The valuation problem is far from academic. In recent years, some huge-scale frauds and near frauds have been facilitated by derivatives trades. In the energy and electric utility sectors, for example, companies used derivatives in trading activities to report great earnings, until the roof fell in when they actually tried to convert the derivatives-related receivables on their balance sheets into cash. Mark-to-market then turned out to be truly mark-to-myth. I can assure you that the marketing errors in the derivatives business have not been symmetrical. Almost invariably, they have favored either the trader who was eyeing a multi-million-dollar bonus or the CEO who wanted to report impressive earnings, or both. The bonuses were paid and the CEO profited from his options. Only much later did shareholders learn that the reported earnings were a sham. Another problem about derivatives is that they can exacerbate trouble that a corporation has run into for completely unrelated reasons. This pile-on effect occurs because many derivatives contracts require that a company suffering a credit downgrade immediately supply collateral to counterparties. Imagine then that a company is downgraded because of general adversity and that its derivatives instantly kick in with their requirement, imposing an unexpected and enormous demand for cash collateral on the company. The need to meet this demand can then throw the company into a liquidity crisis that may, in some cases, trigger still more downgrades. It all becomes a spiral that can lead to a corporate meltdown. Derivatives also create a daisy chain risk that is akin to the risk run by insurers or reinsurers that lay off much of their business with others. In both cases, huge receivables from many counterparties tend to build up over time. A participant may see himself as prudent, believing his large credit exposures to be diversified and therefore not dangerous. Under certain circumstances, though, an exogenous event that causes the receivables from Company A to go bad will also affect those from companies B through Z. History teaches us that a crisis often causes problems to correlate in a manner undreamed of in more tranquil times. In banking, the recognition of a linkage problem was one of the reasons for the formation of the Federal Reserve System. Before the Fed was established, the failure of weak banks would sometimes put sudden and unanticipated liquidity demands on previously strong banks, causing them to fail in turn. The Fed now insulates the strong from the troubles of the weak, but there is no central bank assigned to the job of preventing the dominoes toppling in insurance or derivatives. In these industries, firms that are fundamentally solid can become troubled simply because of the travails of other firms further down the chain. When a chain reaction threat exists within an industry, it pays to minimize links of any kind. That's how we conduct our reinsurance business, and it's one reason we are exiting derivatives. Many people argue that derivatives reduce systemic problems in that participants who can't bear certain risks are able to transfer them to stronger hands. These people believe that derivatives act to stabilize the economy, facilitate trade, and eliminate bumps for individual participants. And, on a micro level, what they say is often true. Indeed, at Berkshire, I sometimes engage in large-scale derivatives transactions in order to facilitate certain investment strategies. Charlie and I believe, however, that the macro picture is dangerous and getting more so. Large amounts of risk, particularly credit risk, have become concentrated in the hands of relatively few derivatives dealers who, in addition, trade extensively with one another. The troubles of one could quickly infect the others. On top of that, these dealers are owed huge amounts by non-dealer counterparties. Some of these counterparties, as I've mentioned, are linked in ways that could cause them to contemporaneously run into a problem because of a single event, such as the implosion of the telecom industry or the precipitous decline in the value of merchant power projects. Linkage, when it suddenly surfaces, can trigger serious systemic problems. Indeed, in 1998, the leveraged and derivatives-heavy activities of a single hedge fund, long-term capital management, caused the Federal Reserve anxieties so severe that it hastily orchestrated a rescue effort. In later congressional testimony, Fed officials acknowledged that, had they not intervened, the outstanding trades of LTCM, a firm unknown to the general public and employing only a few hundred people, could well have posed a serious threat to the stability of American markets. In other words, the Fed acted because its leaders were fearful of what might have happened to other financial institutions had the LTCM domino toppled. And this affair, though it paralyzed many parts of the fixed income market for weeks, was far from a worst-case scenario. One of the derivatives instruments that LTCM used was total return swaps, contracts that facilitate 100% leverage in various markets, including stocks. For example, party A to a contract, usually a bank, puts up all of the money for the purchase of a stock, while party B, without putting up any capital, agrees that at a future date it will receive any gain or pay any loss that the bank realizes. Total return swaps of this type make a joke of margin requirements. Beyond that, other types of derivatives severely curtail the ability of regulators to curb leverage and generally get their arms around the risk profiles of banks, insurers, and other financial institutions. Similarly, even experienced investors and analysts encounter major problems in analyzing the financial condition of firms that are heavily involved with derivatives contracts. When Charlie and I finished reading the long footnotes detailing the derivatives activities of major banks, the only thing we understand is that we don't understand how much risk the institution is running. The derivatives genie is now well out of the bottle, and these instruments will almost certainly multiply in variety and number until some event makes their toxicity clear. Knowledge of how dangerous they are has already permeated the electricity and gas businesses, in which the eruption of major troubles caused the use of derivatives to diminish dramatically. Elsewhere, however, the derivatives business continues to expand unchecked. Central banks and governments have so far found no effective way to control or even monitor the risks posed by these contracts. Charlie and I believe Berkshire should be a fortress of financial strength for the sake of our owners, creditors, policyholders, and employees. We try to be alert to any sort of mega catastrophe risk, and that posture may make us unduly apprehensive about the burgeoning quantities of long-term derivatives contracts and the massive amount of uncollateralized receivables that are growing alongside. In our view, however, derivatives are financial weapons of mass destruction, carrying dangers that, while now latent, are potentially lethal. Long ago, Mark Twain said, "A man who tries to carry a cat home by its tail will learn a lesson that can be learned in no other way." If Twain were around now, he might try winding up a derivatives business. After a few days, he would opt for cats. We lost $104 million pre-tax last year in our continuing attempt to exit Gen Re's derivative operation. Our aggregate losses since we began this endeavor total $404 million. Originally, we had 23,218 contracts outstanding. By the start of 2005, we were down to 2,890. You might expect that our losses would have stemmed by this point, but the blood has kept flowing. Reducing our inventory to 741 contracts last year cost us the $104 million mentioned above. The rationale for establishing this unit in 1990 was Gen Re's wish to meet the needs of insurance clients. Yet one of the contracts we liquidated in 2005 had a term of 100 years. It's difficult to imagine what need such a contract could fulfill except perhaps the need of compensation-conscious trader to have a long-dated contract on his books. Long contracts, or alternatively those with multiple variables, are the most difficult to mark to market, the standard procedure used in accounting for derivatives, and provide the most opportunity for imagination when traders are estimating their value. Small wonder that traders promote them. A business in which huge amounts of compensation flow from assumed numbers is obviously fraught with danger. When two traders execute a transaction that has several, sometimes esoteric variables and a far-off settlement date, their respective firms must subsequently value these contracts whenever they calculate their earnings. A given contract may be valued at one price by firm A and at another by firm B. You can bet that the valuation differences, and I'm personally familiar with several that were huge, tend to be tilted in a direction favoring higher earnings at each firm. It's a strange world in which two parties can carry out a paper transaction that each can promptly report as profitable. I dwell on our experience in derivatives for two reasons. One is personal and unpleasant. The hard fact is that I have cost you a lot of money by not moving immediately to close down Genre's trading operation. Both Charlie and I knew at the time of the Genre purchase that it was a problem and told its management that we wanted to exit the business. It was my responsibility to make sure that happened. Rather than address the situation head-on, however, I wasted several years while we attempted to sell the operation. That was a doomed endeavor because no realistic solution could have extricated us from the maze of liabilities that was going to exist for decades. Our obligations were particularly worrisome because their potential to explode could not be measured. Moreover, if severe trouble occurred, we knew it was likely to correlate with problems elsewhere in financial markets. So I failed in my attempt to exit painlessly, and in the meantime, more trades were put on the books. Fault me for dithering. Charlie calls it thumb-sucking. When a problem exists, whether in personnel or in business operations, the time to act is now. The second reason I regularly describe our problems in this area lies in the hope that our experiences may prove instructive for managers, auditors, and regulators. In a sense, we are a canary in this business coal mine and should sing a song of warning as we expire. The number and value of derivative contracts outstanding in the world continues to mushroom and is now a multiple of what existed in 1998, the last time that financial chaos erupted. Our experience should be particularly sobering because we were a better-than-average candidate to exit gracefully. Additionally, we know of no bad behavior by anyone involved. It could be a different story for others in the future. Imagine, if you will, one or more firms, troubles often spread, with positions that are many multiples of ours attempting to liquidate in chaotic markets and under extreme and well-publicized pressures. This is a scenario to which much attention should be given now rather than after the fact. The time to have considered and improved the reliability of New Orleans' levees was before Katrina. When we finally wind up Genre's securities, my feelings about its departure will be akin to those expressed in a country song. My wife ran away with my best friend, and I sure miss him a lot. The 2006 letter indicates that Genre's derivative operation was finally closed. We have entered into various types of derivatives contracts. That may seem odd given the systemic problems that could result from the enormous growth in the use of derivatives. Why, you may wonder, are we fooling around with such potentially toxic material? The answer is that derivatives, just like stocks and bonds, are sometimes wildly mispriced. For many years, accordingly, we have selectively written derivative contracts, few in number but sometimes for large dollar amounts. We currently have 62 contracts outstanding. I manage them personally, and they are free of counterparty credit risk. So far, these derivative contracts have worked out well for us, producing pre-tax profits in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Though we will experience losses from time to time, we are likely to continue to earn, overall, significant profits from mispriced derivatives. Derivatives are dangerous. They have dramatically increased the leverage and risks in our financial system. They have made it almost impossible for investors to understand and analyze our largest commercial banks and investment banks. They allowed Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to engage in massive misstatements of earnings for years. So indecipherable were Freddie and Fannie that their federal regulator, OFHEO, whose more than 100 employees had no job except the oversight of these two institutions, totally missed their cooking of the books. Indeed, recent events demonstrate that certain big-name CEOs or former CEOs at major financial institutions were simply incapable of managing a business with a huge, complex book of derivatives. Include Charlie and me in this hapless group. When Berkshire purchased General Re in 1998, we knew we could not get our minds around its book of 23,218 derivatives contracts made with 884 counterparties, many of which we had never heard of. So we decided to close up shop. Though we were under no pressure and were operating in benign markets as we exited, it took us 5 years and more than $400 million in losses to largely complete the task. Upon leaving, our feelings about the business mirrored a line in a country song, "I liked you better before I got to know you so well." Improved transparency, a favorite remedy of politicians, commentators, and financial regulators for averting future train wrecks, won't cure the problems that derivatives pose. I know of no reporting mechanism that would come close to describing and measuring the risks in a huge and complex portfolio of derivatives. Auditors can't audit these contracts, and regulators can't regulate them. For a case study on regulatory effectiveness, let's look harder at the Freddie and Fannie example. These giant institutions were created by Congress, which retained control over them, dictating what they could and could not do. To aid its oversight, Congress created OFHEO in 1992, admonishing it to make sure the two behemoths were behaving themselves. With that move, Fannie and Freddie became the most intensely regulated companies of which I am aware, as measured by manpower assigned to the task. On June 15, 2003, OFHEO, whose annual reports are available on the Internet, sent its 2002 report to Congress, specifically to its four bosses in the Senate and House, among them none other than Messrs. Sarbanes and Oxley.